It's great to be joined again by Luke Vargas, who is United Nations Correspondent for Talk Radio News Service. He's been to over 300 campaign events in his storied career covering elections, including for us last election cycle. He joins us now from the New Hampshire Republican sort of debate. This was kind of billed last night, Luke, as kind of the first debate, but not really a debate per se, more of like a question and answer with the candidates. And Donald Trump somewhat noticeably absent in spite of leading a lot of the polls. What was the reason that he didn't show up?
He didn't show up not because he didn't like the forum itself or the way that the event was structured, but because he had beef with one of the local media sponsors. That's the New Hampshire Union Leader, the paper of record, if you want to call it that, in New Hampshire. They had come out and written a pretty scathing article, attacking him for his comments about John McCain. And he said, look, unless you guys endorse me, I'm not going to participate in your events in New Hampshire. So he decided not to come. The conventional wisdom had been that that was going to be a good thing. It would give these other candidates a little more room on stage to shine. I happen to think it had the opposite effect, that it really revealed the extent to which, for many of these candidates, their own perceptions of their campaign have shifted so much because of Donald Trump, that without him there as sort of something to base their own campaign around, that they lost the thread a little bit, and that many of them didn't have the edge that I still predict they will have on Thursday when they get to unveil the narrative they've crafted vis-a-vis Trump for probably a few weeks now.
Yeah, I mean, I found the entire thing to be pretty milquetoast and sort of uninspiring in any way. My reactions were, right off the bat, Rick Perry going first and just would not answer simple questions, right? I mean, he was asked, what do you do about those already in the country illegally? And he instead talked about his experience in Texas securing the border, not giving a direct answer. And that, for me, sort of set the tone for the entire debate.
I couldn't agree more. I think Rick Perry has really proven that he is not a version 2.0 of the failed candidate from 2012. I keep getting emails from his campaign pointing to articles saying he's reinvented himself, that he wasn't ready 4 years ago. I think his weaknesses in the debate format became evident, as you mentioned, right off the bat. He was also asked another softball question, really the softest of softballs, that gave him a chance not only to be serious, but to be comedic. What are the agencies of the federal government that you'd cut? I was astonished he made a joke about it, as if he was anticipating that question, saying, hey, that sounds like a familiar question I've heard in the past. He got some laughs for that, but then he didn't answer it again. And not only didn't answer, but was the only candidate last night to, I guess if you want to call it, attack another candidate. He mentioned Jeb Bush's name, sort of scolding him for not balancing Florida's budget. And then in true Rick Perry debate fashion, on the second reference of the name Jeb, said Joe instead. It was really quite amazing to behold.
And Joe Bush did a terrible job. I just didn't hear a word from him. But so speaking of Jeb, he seemed to kind of just be very ambivalent. He didn't say anything that was outrageous. He spoke in a way that seemed kind of more rational and sober and connected to reality than some of the other candidates. But I didn't really hear him say anything that would even inspire sort of tried and true conservatives either.
In many ways, we know that's a part of his strategy, that is something he's going, and I apologize for the siren, that sounds like it's approaching. But I think one thing that Jeb typified in this debate was sort of a confusion on the part of a lot of the participants as to whether they were going to use the kind of slow-building town hall style meeting presentation of their own positions that they've probably become used to over the last few months. Jeb Bush, I certainly know, has been hitting that circuit quite a lot. Or are you going to open up that playbook that they've probably been, all the one-liners they've been repeating as mantras for Thursday? Are you going to do that? And Jeb Bush seemed very lost as to which style he should use. And the result was, yes, he seemed a little bit disorganized. I thought he stumbled on a few statements in the course of his, rambling speech that he probably wouldn't have agreed with if he just come out swinging with them. He sort of implied that there is a very hard decision you make whether you pursue pursue anti-terrorism policies and defend the homeland, or you put an emphasis on civil liberties. He essentially said we've lost out on the terrorism front because of the lack of focus on civil liberties. I think on the issue of foreign policy, he was asked what I thought again was a pretty straightforward question about how do you factor in the opinions that generals might be providing a president, and he wound up saying that U.S. special forces should be embedded with the Free Syrian Army, a position I think very few people in the foreign policy community, would agree is viable in any fashion whatsoever.
Yeah, so it seemed like an unforced error where he didn't need to be that specific, and in being specific, he said something that just sounded odd and kind of irrational.
I agree completely.
So I was interested in Carly Fiorina's place within that debate, because earlier in today's show, we talked about how this Ted Cruz affiliated PAC donated $500,000 to a Carly Fiorina affiliated PAC. And I sort of speculated that Carly Fiorina is in great part there to attack Hillary Clinton in a way that maybe male candidates would not be allowed to, or might be more criticized for doing. And case in point, she was actually set up in one of the questions to do exactly that, to comment on Hillary Clinton. What was your thought about the questions Carly Fiorina got and how she answered them?
I think it's quite telling that she has chosen not to steer every question towards her business experience. It may be a result of the fact that after trying to emphasize that for a few months now, she is basically at the very back of the pack here. So she has gone on the attack against Hillary Clinton, as you mentioned, also really trying to steer a lot of things towards foreign policy. She gave a big speech at the Reagan Library on foreign policy the other day. Some of the foreign policy commentators that I'm in touch with said she was actually one of the better prepared to answer questions on Syria policy, on the Iranian nuclear deal. That doesn't mean I or these other analysts agree with her positions, but she did seem well prepared. I would say the same thing about Ted Cruz. So again, interesting there that those two figures have emerged as the spokespeople of at least a type of ideology on those foreign policy issues. We'll see if going on the attack against Hillary, emphasizing foreign policy, something a little bit further out of her wheelhouse, will help her. I don't know. Again, it's probably disappointing to the RNC, who would like the diversity on stage that she is, from all indications, not going to be in the top tier on that Fox News Thursday debate. But again, interesting to see her sort of stay away from the business issues and go on the attack, and to go on the attack not just against Hillary, but on the issue of foreign policy.
Let's talk a little bit about Scott Walker, the Republican governor who has just absolutely destroyed jobs in Wisconsin. He was talking about a full repeal of the Affordable Care Act, of Obamacare, which struck me at this point as not even really that great of an example of red meat to throw out there, because it seems completely disconnected from reality now to run on in January 2017, years now beyond the implementation, appeal, and upholding of multiple aspects of the Affordable Care Act, to be talking about repealing Obamacare.
And look, someone who agrees with that argument was on stage. Ben Carson very calmly said, look, you cannot repeal this without having replaced it first. I mean, this is a doctor and someone who was educated at Johns Hopkins. He is trying to say very clearly to the base that you shouldn't trust that kind of rhetoric. Scott Walker, though, you're right, not afraid to keep engaging on that. If I'm not mistaken, he implied or suggested that he wants to make the 2016 election built around being a referendum on repealing Obamacare. I think that was an issue of 4 years ago. I think this law is basically entrenched, and I thought it was quite telling that Ben Carson, who, again, you'd think would be competing for many of the same voters as Scott Walker, had a very different and what I thought was a much more reasonable take on the progression that would be required to make some changes to healthcare.
Last thing I want to touch on, I mentioned at the beginning that the entire thing generally struck me as pretty milquetoast and sort of uninspiring. But there were some candidates that were particularly so. I found Chris Christie had almost nothing. I mean, he essentially was a non-factor in this thing. I found Bobby Jindal to be essentially blending into the background like a ghost. Same thing with Kasich. What was your thought about who really just failed to make any impression at all, positive, negative, or otherwise?
I've got to agree with you on Christie. It's interesting. He was given very easy questions, served up basically the talking points that he uses in his campaign speeches: criminal justice reform, the heroin problem in New Jersey and elsewhere, how to convince people that entitlement reform is necessary if it's unpopular. And again, he seemed to resort, and this is a trapping of New Hampshire sometimes. You want to use New Hampshire as a way of honing your presentation style, but a candidate like John McCain showed that you have to be able to present your argument in two different ways, one to the national audience and one to voters in New Hampshire. Christie seemed very stuck in his town hall meeting style delivery. He was going through the beats. I think one of the stronger parts of his campaign is his message of compassion, if you want to call it that, on criminal justice reform, not imprisoning nonviolent first-time offenders. But even that, I thought, came off as very rehearsed. He quoted the same biblical phrase that he's been quoting everywhere he goes. And I think he really perhaps is getting too deep into New Hampshire. He's obviously not pursuing a national strategy. And I thought that was very clear in the debate.
All right, well, we will absolutely be watching the Thursday night debate, the Facebook Fox News debate, as it's being billed. We've been speaking with Luke Vargas, UN correspondent for Talk Radio News Service, joining us from the Republican New Hampshire sort of debate. Thanks, Luke.
Thank you.